Hello ladies and gentlemen and welcome to The Right Opinion, the home of a twat with too much free time. What is inherently wrong with going after bullies in-game and giving them what's what? Well, today we're going to investigate that and work out how such an organisation like Bully Hunters has arisen and how it's subsequently been lambasted by everyone. But before we get any further, to those who are out the loop, what are Bully Hunters? Well, the Bully Hunter campaign was set up in the light of harassment. Basically what the method is, when you're in-game and you're experiencing some twat, for example, there's some spotty kid going to tell you to go in the kitchen and make a fucking sandwich, you go on the website and you go and call that Bully Hunter. That Bully Hunter links up with your Steam so they can join your game and they deal with that fucking bully. They'll kill that fucking bully in-game and leave them with a message saying that harassment will not be tolerated. Capiche? The problem is no more. But why would there be a necessity for something like this in gamer culture? Why would we ever need that? Well, maybe to understand that, we have to go back in time a bit. So let's hop in the time machine and get some context. Today we're going into real gamer hours. One of the most infamous associations with gamer culture, and something that was clearly rooted in the Bully Hunt campaign, is gamers and their supposed hostility, most notably to females. Now, this is clearly rooted in some observable evidence. However, a lot of people just observe this and point at it and say it's a problem, rather than asking the deeper questions for why it has arisen. We should firstly question the nature that would create such an environment, where it's not too hard to understand how such a situation can arise. So let us list out a catalogue of prerequisites to fulfill. Firstly, online gaming is competitive. There's an inherently important point to note. It's empirically proven that often when people compete against each other, they may not be the friendliest, especially when they feel that there is something to gain, whether it's a reward or mere status. That is a primary condition for such an environment. Other gamers will apply many mental tactics to try and gain advantage over their opponent, especially when they're losing, which is why trash talk is much more likely to occur between teams rather than within teams. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but that's an important first point. The next point to make is that it's a lot easier to intimidate over the medium of a video game. Your name is protected by an alias and your identity is pretty much completely veiled. You do not know the people who you're interacting with unless you're in a friends group of whom I assume you wouldn't bully. Whatever you say in these places will almost certainly not come back to you. Basically what that means is that when this culture is created, it can spread very quickly under the premise of anonymity. Then we need to observe the demographics. Bully Hunter was promoted on Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This is no coincidence. There is a largely male fanbase for many shooter games in particular. Now there can be many hypotheses for why that is, but currently it is what it is. Then we infuse the fact that gamers on average are not generally as mature as typical law-abiding citizens. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with being slightly immature. I'd argue that I'm very juvenile from time to time. But you put all these together and yes, you're going to have some sort of outcome which may result in the verbal degradation of others around you. I don't think that's on gaming itself. I think that's on the very particular aesthetics that culminate around such an environment, which is magnified particularly in this scenario. So I don't believe the idea that certain things such as misogyny existing on a proportionally greater scale within such games is an unfounded one, but I do believe that it is something in need of more elaboration, and it should also be put into perspective. Human beings don't tend to go on to games with an agenda, and I think that's an important point. A very high majority of people do not go into games with the intention of abusing people or spreading toxic ideas, particularly the latter. You're not going to be using Counter-Strike Global Offensive to recruit for your chauvinist cult, to say the least. I'm not trying to give anyone any ideas. So then we have to question, what is the ideological system behind these games? Being the MVP? Being the victors? Being the best? Shooters in particular are very domination oriented. Many want to assert themselves as in charge, and therefore this will lead to them taking up a caricature of what they perceive to be the most successful in-game persona. This is obviously the alpha male. However, given the fact that many of these people's understanding of what it takes to be an alpha male is somewhat two-dimensional, it'll often lead to, quote, abuse tactics in a direct attempt to subjugate their opposites, which is why, although misogyny may be observed as more precedent, it would not surprise me if abuse in general was higher across the board, particularly male on male, and even female on male. If I were to take a guess, most abuse would revolve around players calling each other virgins, going after their libido, presenting them as effeminate and unsuccessful. However, one of the greatest mistakes in my opinion is then assuming that the game is the sole cause of the behavior. This is also an important point, and there is a lot of important points that you need to put together in your head today because we are putting the pieces of a puzzle together. Just because something may create an environment where it can happen doesn't mean it will happen. Now, for all you lads coming down to Education Corner with me, the right opinion, this is something known as retrospective determinism. Don't pull this out of your ass all the time, but it's a fun little fact and little word nugget to make you feel a bit smarter. If abuse is higher proportionally, it's hard to say that it's something specifically pertaining to gender, and more of a Darwinistic drive for dominance within a game that implicitly promotes hierarchy. However, it wouldn't be right to talk about this without talking about the other topics that are often conflated, which I personally believe to be a very different matter, but due to the correlation, a causal link is often drawn, which is obviously out-of-game politics. Now, video games are at a very unique position with their market. They're not centralized in the sort of Hollywood bubble, and therefore haven't been dominated by a lot of progressive politics associated with that. However, journalism in particular seems very driven to subscribe to those ideas. Nonetheless, this has not come without its resistance, and many seem very defiant to preserve certain aspects of game. Now, to speak about politics, you have to speak about Gamergate, a scandal which pitted these two very distinct sects against each other. Now, I do not wish to speak too much about it specifically because I was not there, and it appears to be a situation which is really fucking hard to find an unbiased testimony. With all that in mind, I still see people talking about the topic today, with many advocates still romanticizing over it in an attempt to present themselves as martyrs. There has often been a lot of retrospective reframing of what has happened, and people attempting to construct a podium out of it to launch their careers. I'm not gonna name any names, but it's pretty fucking obvious. Anyhow, this has led to the constantly renewing debate of sexism within the games industry. But what this seems to forget is that many gamers that I've exemplified earlier in this video are not remotely political, they're just juvenile. Some of which I'm sure have never even heard of Gamergate. Back in 2013, the only way I had heard of Gamergate was through the Angry Joe show. I genuinely didn't know what he was talking about. So all this basically leads to back and forth between Twitter pseudo-intellectuals on stuff that is really rather ineffectual to many people who do not use these websites. And believe me, there are many places where sites like Twitter are not overwhelmingly popular. Where I'm from in particular, we're almost all resident on Facebook, and I'm the exception. But while this is all transpiring, these sorts of people, the journalists, are all looking for a way to combat what they see as the rampant aggression within games. But by kind of responding to something that is actually quite psychologically rooted and treating it with the heavy hand of politicization, this can lead to many ham-fisted attempts to try and prevent toxic mentalities, and I think it's necessary to discuss how it's escalated to that point. And then we will get to the magnum opus, Bully Hunter, and how such a tame movement became the breaking point for the strain on the gaming community. Everyone knows about the debates that arise from gamers, games, and so on. Now, as observed, I've noted there has been a certain stigma raised around the gaming community, particularly on the image created by a lot of its detractors when presenting the issues such as harassment. Let's discuss how this response has evolved over time. One of the primary responses adopted by a lot of reactionaries was to immediately blame the games they were playing. Now, I explain why this is a mostly false narrative in another one of my videos, so I'm not going to touch on it too much now, but it should be quite clear that from what I've presented, that it's not games themselves that cause the dangerous mentalities. And yes, there are instances in which unhinged individuals carried out crimes mimicking video games, but many of those individuals were shown to be rather delusional in their own capacity without the assistance of video games. However, this does not stop them from nailing in the narrative, most recently in the light of the Parkland shooting. Although that legacy appears to be dying a very horrible death very rapidly. Many have suggested boycotting games that might include a high level of violence, harassment, and other suggestive ideologies such as misogyny. Famously, an Australian petition made Target remove GTA 5 from their shelves completely because many didn't like the way the game framed the treatment of women. Now, call me Nostradamus, but I expect the implications of such a move to be absolutely zilched, in spite of its earnest intentions. However, this was the case of a society that didn't really completely grasp the nature of video games. It always happens whenever something is new and perhaps controversial is introduced, people will jump in, convinced it will lead to the inevitable destruction of society as we know it. And as we have become more familiarized with this, there has been a shift away from this responsibility on games, and many people generally understand there is not much of a causal relationship, though there are some people who like to push the blame whenever it's convenient for their agenda. So eventually people moved away from that. After all, most people project themselves onto video games and not vice versa. The video game may activate the behavior, but it was still within the person. And yes, sure, there are some young kids who might be impressionable, but I would make the argument that the responsibility lies on the parent to make sure that their child behaves sensibly and not on the state. So what now? I said earlier we have two very separate concepts, politicization of games and competition within games, both of which cause great debates. Gaming as an industry is primarily male. As I've said, there are likely many explanations for that. However, given the recent drive for equal representation within industries, it has faced fierce criticism for its current makeup. However, the campaign within the games industry has seemed much more personal than many others. If you talk about the gender pay gap in In banking, for example, you wouldn't talk about the regional managers. Even other media persuasions such as television and music have faced much less controversy in how they handle such topics. Why is this? Well, that overlap that I have been talking about, whereas many industries such as TV haven't been excessively criticized as a culture for the issues discussed today, the gaming industry is often alleged to have this sort of bad aura about it, probably because it doesn't have the same filter that other industries have on. Gamers are much more integral to the games. You wouldn't have the viewers or the listeners, for example, being the centerpiece in your content when we're talking about film or music. Gamers, on the other hand, are very central, and they're not always politically correct. And eventually, many journalists in particular assumed the best way to combat this was to actually try and project their agendas into the content, and that just didn't work, either leading to the tiresome Twitter threads mentioned earlier, or just shouting loudly into an echo chamber. But mostly what this overlap between politicization and casual gamers yielded was either backlash or no reaction whatsoever, because although there may have been people participating in the sort of alpha male projection that we can witness, it didn't reflect genuine beliefs of any sort, and they are behaviors that many a person would inevitably grow out of regardless. You had the campaigns to deal with it in-game attitude and aggression, violence, etc., and you had the out-of-game push for diversification. Much of the out-of-game conflict was projected onto in-game assets, which, as I expressed earlier, I believe to be the result of a very different cause. However, no one wanted to nuance that perspective, and it regularly became a pastime for many journalists to go in on gamers with no real plan, as if complaining about them on a web article would solve their problem. This led to the creation of caricatures that firstly didn't represent many gamers, and secondly didn't even reflect the nature of the political opposition that their own agendas faced. In the end, they just pissed people off who'd never heard of their arguments, and first impressions are pretty fucking important. When people get pissed, they didn't think to evaluate the arguments, which even if they had some validity, were presented in the most sanctimonious way possible. So, with all that in mind, what do? There's clearly a rift that needs to be abridged. Was it time for someone to grab the bull by the horns? One day, someone was sitting down looking over their condominium and thinking, how do I really take out all these horrible, racist, sexist gamers who constantly belittle my existence? How do we make gaming a welcome environment for everyone? Instead of going on Polygon and writing some argument lamenting the latest offensive trend that will probably be irrelevant in a few months' time, they thought, you know what? We're going to take the battle to them, and we're going to make them stop being bullies. We're gonna hunt them. Bully Hunter has to be one of the worst ideas that has ever come to mind. And yet, only in the twisted world that we reside in could it have A, ever happened, and B, ever faced such a reaction. But let's break that down. Going after people who are being cunts in-game, on the surface, does not sound like a disastrous idea. If I was to sit down with you and say, let's go after people being rude bellends, and give them what for, it would probably be a pretty lit time. I want to say that Bully Hunter went one step further, but I think that would be underselling how many steps further they went. Let's just map this out. A serious organization that stops people harassing by killing them in-game. In the demonstration, you can hear the apprehension in the applause when the audience realized what they had witnessed. But why has this happened? Well, as I said, it's kind of grown out of the intent to get the gamers, despite having really nothing to do with what a lot of these journalists claim to be concerned about. Presented with the strawmans that had been constructed, they decided that they were going to make gaming a safer space for everyone, and go after some bullies. But gaming, and more importantly bully hunting, didn't work how they envisioned it. Let's break it down. Firstly, when you experience the harassment, you can call on the bully hunter. This raises immediate red flags, as it makes you question, well, what constitutes harassment? How does the bully hunter know that a report is honest? How is it not completely open to exploitation? If someone has a grudge and wants to make a false report, can they just do that? How can someone not impersonate a bully hunter? Anyone can change their stream tag. It's not rocket science. If the game's full, do they just wait to join? What if the game finishes, and what if you leave the game? Where do they go? The stream didn't show the bully hunter gauging the situation before acting, just jumping in and killing the person. This also brings in the point that the person making the report can hold the bully hunter to rating ransom. What do I mean by this? Well, if you can call in the bully hunter, you can subsequently rate them on their job of eliminating the threat. But in a competitive environment, this no longer becomes a question of how well they do the job, rather how well they fulfill their client's desires. Now to that, some might say, well, what's the problem with doing what the client wants? In most occupations, I would agree. But in this one, it directly involves dealing with someone else in an environment that makes a person inherently biased. So yes, a rating system is a terrible idea. This would be a more prominent issue in itself if it wasn't overshadowed by an issue that renders this borderline invalid. The fact that the idea of the bully hunters dealing with the bullies is killing them in-game, and then leaving them with a disparaging message. That is it. Let's break down the numerous problems with this. The idea that killing someone in-game that focuses around killing people is rather insubstantial. That would be like punishing someone in football by tackling them. It's kind of the point already, and yes, you could argue that it is more specifically targeted, which could irritate the player, but in a game like CSGO, being killed is commonplace that it really wouldn't make the gamer reconsider their position on in-game verbal abuse. In fact, they were probably pissed off, it'd probably make them more pissed off, and thus more abusive. Often such abuse is compensative anyway, a lot of these kids trying to make up for the fact that they're having a shit game. A real gamer ain't gotta prove they're real as long as they know it. So the virgins that you probably go after, dying once more, would have little to no effect on their mentality, and if the gamer is actually accomplished, then surely the bully hunter isn't invincible, surely they can die too. This is actually empirically supported by studies that state men who are having a bad game are more likely to act aggressively. I don't know about you lads and lasses, but if I've had a bad game, it's much more probable for me to come off a bit livid.
Oh, dude, I hope I didn't break it, dude. Oh, dude, what the fuck? Here though. Oh,
Lads,
don't record it. Don't!
Also, the message that the bully hunter leaves refers exactly to the reason that they have been hunted, and now they know they have upset someone to the point of calling in other people to save them. They'll just go in harder and harder and harder. The bully hunters did a live stream where everything went surprisingly, well, suspiciously smooth, and although it's not something that they could immediately prove as fake, the bullies seemed extremely cliche to say the least. Now, the point in cliches is that they do exist, but on top of that, the fact that they had absolutely no problems with such an observably flawed concept made it highly questionable, and many Counter-Strike gamers, especially experienced ones, called it fake. Now, in response, one of the livestream hosts, Zombie Unicorn, said that she flubbed a line emphasizing it was fake. That is bullshit. And alright, you can't do anything outside the realms of what the game allows you to do. What else can they do? This is a fair question, but just because you can't answer it immediately doesn't mean that any compromise is necessarily worth investing in. And speaking of investors, let's talk about how that's turning out, shall we? I remember when I saw a pair of headphones being advertised in my feed and I thought to myself, how will wearing headphones end bullying? This was before the bully hunters controversy transpired, so I was genuinely clueless of what the point was. Now I have some clarity with regards to it, it makes the situation even more laughable. Upon the tidal wave of criticism approaching them, the prime sponsors who made the headphones, SteelSeries, completely withdrew their support and published a remorseful Facebook post reflecting their involvement. They, like myself, touch on some important discussion, and that will transition us into our next point. Why did it receive such attention for a project that in theory seems so modest? Because it was a crossover. The pinnacle crossover between out-of-game activism and in-game realism. Most gamers just want a game. Most gamers do not give a shit about this and do not want to give a shit about this. Now, certain individuals have often been criticized for misrepresenting the gamosphere. However, if you're one of those people who has done that, you're somewhat safe in the ivory tower you've constructed for yourself, because to bitch about gamers is so broad that you can say a lot without being called out. However, as soon as you go in-game, the ivory tower comes tumbling down. And their naivety to these gaming environments is desperately exposed. Most importantly, it finally brought that in-game and out-of-game backlash together. Everyone from PewDiePie to the Chicago Tribune were commenting on it, and the flaws were out in the open to scrutinize. I highly doubt that they will have the humility to take anything away from this, but maybe this will bring some insight to the actual in-game truths rather than the expectations implanted from an outsider's point of view. This incident does cater to the narrative that many people who write these articles have very little exposure to the actual environment, or seem to exaggerate the victimhood that does occur. If I wanted to go and shoot some people in-game who were being cunts, it would be fine for some short-term amusement, but it would be for my amusement, and I would totally anticipate being barraged by hate due to it. On top of that, if I said to them, I'll stop killing you if you stop being rude, I think the reply I received may include a few expletives. Harassment is shit, but some people go into these games looking to be the antithesis of victims. They want to tell these virgins exactly where they can shove it. There's a difference that you cannot really apprehend how to deal with something so abstract as in-game aggression. The whole situation information inevitably leaves the gaming world in a weird place, and maybe for a brief moment, people will be able to see the reality over the lampoons. People want to do these campaigns, more power to them, but understand the relativity of it, and stop attacking or mischaracterizing people who have very little interest in your agenda, because it just opposes them to you. And if you want people to hear you out, you have to separate them from your already existing critics, and appeal to them. They may not agree, but at least they wouldn't be alienated, and you wouldn't be embarrassed when you try to create depictions of how they actually behave. Chances are that the people in the wrong, well, if you believe they're in the wrong that is, will go back to mudslinging in the columns, and then questioning why people aren't on board with them. It's clear that that's a cycle that they're much more comfortable with. What has occurred is people identifying the problem but not really asking themselves how and why, then conflating their agenda and then pointing fingers at people that really have much less to do with it than they think they do, and eventually creating something that completely exposes that flawed line of thinking. As I've noted, there are many reasons that such an environment can arise: the in-game goals, the competitiveness, the person themselves. But that is an inherently natural outcome from the society that we live in today, and you really have to look much beyond the mentality of video games and more towards social causes if you ever wanted to change and address that. And make no mistake, you may not be able to change that, and even if you can, it would be an incredibly challenging task. But that doesn't mean you settle for really bad compromises. And I don't mean like going for second best, because there may be some other options that could work, but this option clearly doesn't, and it just rubs everyone the wrong way. So maybe it's just time to change the narrative and change the tone that you're taking when dealing with these issues that you know exist. You're not perfect either, just saying. Either way, I would love to hear what you think of this topic. Let me know down below in the little lovely bloody comment section. And massive thanks to the editors who have made this magic happen once again. Keep up the great work, blokes. And thank you so much for all your support recent. It's been really special, and I'm glad to be back. It makes me feel welcome. So let me know what you think. I'm always open to discussion. I'd love to hear your point of view. However, until then, I'm The Right Opinion, and I'll see you in the next one.